competition. Today we're going to have a formative assessment in Schoology. We're going to investigate how organisms and populations in an ecosystem depend on and may compete for biotic factors such as food and abiotic factors such as quantity of light, water, range of temperature, or soil competition. So, we're going to watch a video on food webs and energy pyramids by the Amoeba Sisters, and then we'll answer the starter about what happens to the organism in an ecosystem if biotic and or abiotic factors are added and removed. So we'll have a discussion about the video after.
When we were little, we loved nature shows. One reason was because we didn't have cable, and it was one of the few things we actually got a TV signal for that didn't require you to dance around with the TV antenna for reception. But the other reason was that, of course, it was cool science. It often showed animals that we couldn't see in our own backyard doing some awesome things. But then it would be a little traumatizing when, inevitably, some predator would walk in and gobble the unsuspecting animal up. Truly, action scenes with predators and prey are often shown in nature shows because it's all part of nature's food chains. A food chain starts with a producer. A producer is an organism that is an autotroph, which means that it makes its own food. A plant, for example. The plant is eaten by a primary consumer, this grasshopper here. Consumers are heterotrophs, which means that they need to feed on other organisms. The primary consumer is eaten by a secondary consumer, this frog. The secondary consumer is eaten by a tertiary consumer, this snake. And the food chain can keep going. Notice how the arrows are supposed to point in the direction of one doing the eating, which makes sense because that's the direction of the energy flow. You can also arrange this same food chain into an energy pyramid. The producers are at the base here, in trophic level 1. They actually contain the most energy. What is crazy to think about is the primary consumers here, in trophic level 2, they actually only store 10% of the energy from the producers. Meaning, let's say the plants here had 10,000 kilocalories. That's an energy unit of energy. Well, the next level here, the primary consumers in trophic level 2, they would only store 1,000 kilocalories of energy. So, where did the rest of the energy go? Much of it is lost in heat or undigested. If you go up to the secondary consumers in trophic level 3, that would be only 100 kilocalories of energy. So, as you go up each trophic level, it's roughly only 10% of the energy from the trophic level below that will be stored. Back to our food chain. Notice that, like a domino effect, if something is removed, let's say the grasshoppers, you can harm the others because they might not have enough to eat. You really have to consider the relationships among organisms in a food chain. In fact, even if you took out the apex predator in this particular food chain, which is the snake, you could end up with an excessive population of frogs. And so many frogs that it's possible they wouldn't have enough grasshoppers to even support them. This is actually not a very good model because in real life, this snake probably doesn't just eat frogs. It probably eats rabbits and birds too, because an ecosystem doesn't typically have a single food chain. Instead, it has more of a food web. A food web is made up of multiple food chains that interact together. So notice how now we have multiple food chains here tied in with our original to make a food web. The beauty of a food web is that it shows more interactions among a variety of producers and various level consumers. It also can show biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety of organisms, all types of organisms, living in a given area. The size of the area that we're talking about, as well as the climate of the area, directly affect the biodiversity that is present. Biodiversity can contribute to the sustainability of an ecosystem. What I mean by that is, let's say there was a decrease in the amount of small birds in this food web. Well, it's likely that will be harmful to other organisms. However, it is not the only thing that the snakes feed on. They have other options because of the biodiversity. The snakes also eat rabbits and they eat frogs. So, because of this biodiversity, the ecosystem might be more resilient to changes such as these and possibly recover. However, these changes can still have detrimental effects, and it's why it's critical to protect ecosystem biodiversity. High biodiversity has a lot of other benefits. They can include economics, and we'll need another video to really touch on all the benefits of high biodiversity. So, if we were to ask you which of our examples here had more biodiversity, our food chain here or our food web, you would definitely want to pick the food web. One last thing, there are some organisms that we left out of our food webs and food chains, but they're kind of a big deal. Decomposers. Decomposers are heterotrophs since they do eat other things, even if the things they're eating are dead. Decomposers include organisms like bacteria and fungus. Technically, if we were to draw them in, then every arrow here would eventually point to them. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
Okay, so cool. We just saw the amoeba sisters, and our starter was asking us what happens to organisms in an ecosystem if biotic and abiotic factors are added or removed. So we know organisms rely on abiotic, those non living things, and those living things as well. They interact with one another. So when we take biotic or abiotic factors out, competition occurs between organisms in food chains and food webs. Okay. For our practice today, the Amoeba Sisters talked a little bit about biodiversity. Well, the tropical rainforest has the greatest biodiversity of any type of ecosystem. How does biodiversity contribute to sustainability of an ecosystem? Well, more species, more likely to survive an ecological disaster. So, if a flood or a fire occurred, if there's more species, okay, it's more likely to survive such a disaster. There's greater genetic variation when you have high biodiversity. You also have a great variety of producers to support relationships in a food web when there's high biodiversity. Let's compare and contrast the biodiversity of a grassland and a desert ecosystem. Which ecosystem would be more likely to survive if a disease killed the grasses? So, if grasses were wiped out in a grassland, um, a desert ecosystem would be more likely to survive if the grasses were perished because you have more of a variety of producers here than you do in just the grassland. Food webs and energy. Producers capture energy from the sun. So here we have a producer, a dandelion. It captures energy from the sun. They make their own food. Producers are also called autotrophs. Autotrophs automatically make their own food. Consumers get their energy by eating other organisms. They're also called heterotrophs. So, a heterotroph would be any organism that eats another organism. Identify the producer, the autotroph, in this terrestrial food web. So, here we have the plant, it's a dandelion. That would be the autotroph. It automatically makes its own food using the sun's energy. Identify a consumer. So any of these organisms would be a consumer, also known as a heterotroph. Practice food webs and energy. Herbivores eat producers. For example, the rabbit gets its energy from the dandelion. So it's an herbivore. It eats only plants. I like to say it eats only herbs. Carnivores only eat other animals. For example, the hawk will get its energy from the snake, from the mouse, from the rabbit. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. For example, a grizzly bear would eat fruits, and berries, as well as other animals. Decomposers break down dead, decaying material. For example, an ant would break down these organisms after they die. So today we're going to do a drag and drop with definitions and pictures to match the vocabulary word. So here we have a producer. A producer can make its own food. So here's a picture of a producer. Okay, and now I want to find a definition of a producer. A producer is an organism that can make its own food. A consumer. A consumer is an organism that obtains its energy from other organisms. Or, let's see, a consumer eats only animals. I would say a consumer eats only animals. And if we wanted to find a picture of a consumer, I would go, we could say the lion. If we need to move around, we can. An herbivore is an organism that eats only plants. So a consumer that eats only plants is an herbivore. So a picture of an herbivore would be a rabbit. I know it eats only plants. A carnivore. Carnivore would be an organism that obtains its energy from other organisms. Probably. Let's drag that over there. And so going over to my pictures, a carnivore, I would say would be the lion. So I'm going to switch him down there. So a consumer eats only animals. I would switch these definitions around too. So a consumer would be an organism that obtains its energy from other organisms. And then a consumer, a carnivore is going to be a consumer that eats only animals. An omnivore is going to be a consumer that eats both plants and animals. So I'm going to move that there. And then a picture of an omnivore would be a bear. A decomposer would be an organism that breaks down dead, decaying organisms. Okay, so that is our drag and drop for these terms when we use food webs, food chains, and ecosystems. For our STAR test question today, let's read it for our exit. It says wild hogs introduced to Texas from Europe became feral after the hogs escaped ranches where they lived. Feral hogs are omnivores. So remember your term for an omnivore. It eats both plants and animals. They feed on native plants, crops, and small animals. Feral hogs can damage an ecosystem by rooting through the soil to look for food and trampling small plants. Which type of native organisms do feral hogs most likely compete with for food resources? So, would a feral hog compete for carnivores and producers? Well, we know that producers do not have competition because they make their own food, so that would be incorrect. Would hogs compete with herbivores and carnivores? Probably most likely because we know herbivores eat only plants and so does the feral hog. They would also compete with carnivores that eat other organisms because the feral hog also eats small animals. So this looks pretty good. So again, in letter C, there's no competition with producers, and then there's no competition with decomposers that break down dead or decaying material. So your best answer choice here would be B. So you guys have a formative assessment today in Schoology. These are the things you'll need to know. Organisms compete with other living things for resources, biotic and abiotic. They need to survive. Organisms compete for biotic factors such as predator prey relationships. Organisms compete for abiotic factors such as sunlight in a rainforest canopy. You'll need to know the amount of resources in any ecosystem is limited. And you also need to know how to identify the effect of a limiting resources competition on organisms by analyzing graphs, data table, pie charts, and food webs.